There are secrets that nations bury so deep that even the most powerful technologies of their time cannot reach them. And then there are secrets so ancient, so biologically encoded, that they survive every attempt at erasure, waiting patiently for a century that finally has the tools to read them. The story of Abraham Lincoln is one of the most exhaustively documented narratives in American history. We know the jokes he told at dinner, the dreams he shared with his wife, the exact words he whispered before the theater curtain rose on the last night of his life. Yet for all of that documentation, there was always one door he kept locked. One room in the house of his identity where he refused to let anyone enter. That room belonged to his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, a woman who died in the Indiana wilderness when her son was just 9 years old, leaving behind no letters, no portraits, and no explanation for who she truly was. Scientists in the 21st century decided to pick that lock. What they found on the other side has permanently altered the way we understand not just Abraham Lincoln, but the hidden, tangled roots of America itself. To appreciate the magnitude of what modern genetics has uncovered, you first have to understand the strangeness of Lincoln's silence. This was a man who was extraordinarily verbal. He wrote his own speeches by hand, debated with the sharpest legal minds of his generation, and corresponded with generals, senators, and grieving widows with equal eloquence. Language was his weapon and his shield. Yet on the subject of his maternal heritage, this master communicator became a stone wall. When campaign managers in 1860 pressed him for biographical details to use in their rallies and newspapers, Lincoln offered almost nothing. He gestured vaguely at poverty, at frontier hardship, at bootstraps and log cabins. He recited a line of poetry and called it autobiography. The men who knew him best, men like his law partner William Herndon, who spent decades reconstructing Lincoln's inner life after his assassination, noticed something more than humility in this reticence. They noticed fear. Whenever the Hanks family came up in conversation, the warmth would drain from Lincoln's face. The famous storyteller would go quiet. A heaviness would settle over him that his friends described as something close to grief. He once admitted, in a rare unguarded moment, that he believed himself to be the descendant of a well-bred Virginia nobleman, a confession that stunned those who heard it and has puzzled historians ever since. Why would the President of the United States whisper this admission like a man confessing to a priest, rather than declaring it as a point of pride? The answer, it now appears, was never simply about illegitimacy. It was never just about the social embarrassment of an uncertain birth certificate or a missing father's name. Nancy Hanks herself was a figure so unusual for her time and place that even her neighbors, barely educated frontier settlers with little exposure to the wider world, sensed that something about her was different. Accounts from those who knew her describe a woman who was tall and thin with dark, striking features, a woman who could read and write with fluency in a community where illiteracy was the norm. She was described as deeply melancholic, intellectually restless, and somehow out of place against the rough backdrop of the Kentucky and Indiana wilderness. People who encountered the Hanks family more broadly noted that they moved constantly, appearing in one county and then vanishing before the census taker could record them properly, resurfacing somewhere else under slightly altered circumstances. They were a family that seemed to be perpetually on the run from something that no one could quite name. In the rigid social world of early 19th century America, where bloodline was considered destiny and a man's worth was often measured by his ancestry, this kind of rootlessness was not merely inconvenient. It was dangerous. And Nancy Hanks carried the full weight of that danger in silence until the milk sickness took her, leaving her young son to inherit a mystery he would never solve. What Abraham Lincoln could not solve with memory, modern science has now approached with extraordinary precision. The field of mitochondrial DNA analysis, a branch of genetics that would have seemed like pure sorcery to anyone living in the 19th century, offered researchers a remarkable tool for cutting through 2 centuries of obscured records and missing documentation. Unlike the genetic material we inherit from both parents, which blends and recombines with every new generation like shuffled playing cards, mitochondrial DNA passes exclusively from mother to child in an essentially unchanged form. It is the genetic equivalent of a message written in permanent ink, carried forward through an unbroken chain of mothers and daughters across thousands of years. To trace the maternal heritage of Nancy Hanks, Researchers did not need to exhume any bones or locate any burial site. They needed only to identify living women who could demonstrate an unbroken maternal line of descent from the same ancestral source. That painstaking verification process, cross-referencing oral histories, baptismal records, land deeds, and family trees, consumed years of collaborative effort. But eventually, a team of genealogists and molecular biologists had what they needed. The samples were collected. The sequencing began. And the results, when they finally appeared on laboratory monitors, stopped the researchers cold. The genetic designation that emerged from the Nancy Hanks maternal line was not the expected signature of a standard Anglo-Saxon pioneer family. The most common mitochondrial haplogroup in the British Isles, the genetic fingerprint of the vast majority of settlers who crossed the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th centuries, did not appear. What appeared instead was something that population geneticists describe in terms that border on the reverential. Haplogroup X. To understand why this result was so electrifying and so deeply unsettling, you need to understand what haplogroup X actually represents in the story of human migration. It is one of the rarest maternal lineages on the planet, found in barely 2% of the European population and at even lower frequencies across most of the globe. Its distribution on the world map does not follow the clean lines of historical migration that textbooks describe. Instead, it appears in scattered, inexplicable pockets, in certain communities of the ancient Levant, among isolated populations in the Caucasus, and then, with no obvious geographical bridge to explain its presence, among specific Native American tribes of the Great Lakes region, particularly those of Algonquian linguistic heritage. The gap between these populations, geographically and historically, is one of the most debated puzzles in all of modern genetics. Haplogroup X does not behave the way migration patterns are supposed to behave. It crosses oceans and epochs in ways that defy conventional explanation. And somehow, it was sitting quietly in the bloodline of the woman who gave birth to Abraham Lincoln. The researchers who first confirmed this result did not celebrate. By multiple accounts, the initial reaction in the laboratory was disbelief, followed by a methodical series of retests designed to rule out contamination, sequencing error, or mislabeled samples. Each retest returned the same answer. The genetic marker was real. It had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, moving forward through generations of Hanks women who had no language to describe what they carried, and perhaps a very powerful incentive to never speak of it at all. When the scientists finally accepted what the data was telling them, they found themselves confronting implications that extended far beyond a single famous family. The presence of haplogroup X in the American Southeast during the early 19th century suggests that the Hanks family was not simply a poor, undocumented pioneer clan. It suggests they were the surviving carriers of a lineage that had arrived on this continent through a route entirely outside the familiar story of European settlement. Whether that route represented an ancient pre-Columbian migration across the Atlantic, a connection to indigenous populations that had been long suppressed from family memory, or something else altogether, the researchers could not say with certainty. But the implications were staggering in any direction you chose to follow them. There is a community of historical researchers who have long argued, against considerable skepticism from mainstream academia, that certain isolated Appalachian and southern frontier families carried genetic and cultural traces of ancestry that their official documents would never acknowledge. The Melungeons, a mysterious population of mixed and uncertain origin who settled in the isolated mountain hollows of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, are one such group. For generations they were described by their neighbors as neither fully white nor clearly indigenous, possessing features and traditions that didn't fit neatly into any recognized category of 19th-century American identity. They endured harassment, legal discrimination, and social marginalization. In response, many of them did what persecuted people throughout history have always done. They moved quietly, changed their names, blurred the edges of their family histories, and taught their children to pass. The Hanks family's almost compulsive nomadism, their fractured paper trail, and their habit of appearing and disappearing across the frontier landscape without leaving solid records begins to look different when viewed through this lens. It stops looking like simple poverty and starts looking like deliberate survival strategy. It starts looking like a family that knew, on some deep inherited level, that visibility was a form of vulnerability. And then there is Abraham Lincoln himself, the physical evidence that his contemporaries noticed but could never quite categorize. He stood 6 feet 4 inches in an era when the average man stood 5 feet 6. His limbs were elongated to a degree that struck people who met him as almost surreal. His face was famously asymmetrical, with deep-set eyes and a bone structure that photographers of his era found notoriously difficult to capture in a way that looked natural. He was, by any measure, a biological outlier, a man whose body seemed to have been assembled according to specifications that didn't quite match the standard frontier blueprint. For years, physicians and historians have proposed various syndromes to explain his unusual physiology. But none of those explanations has ever been fully satisfying, because they treat his body as a malfunction rather than as an inheritance. The genetic research on Nancy Hanks opens a different kind of conversation entirely. It raises the possibility that what Lincoln's contemporaries experienced as his strange, towering, otherworldly physical presence was not the product of a disease but the product of a lineage. An ancient, geographically isolated line of maternal descent that had developed across thousands of years of separation from the mainstream of European genetic history. The psychological dimensions of this discovery are perhaps even more profound than the physical ones. Lincoln's depression, what he himself called his melancholy, and what modern clinicians would likely classify as a severe, recurrent depressive disorder, has been studied extensively. It was not a passing sadness. It was a constitutional darkness that followed him from early adulthood through the White House, a weight so visible in his later photographs that people who meet his gaze across 160 years of history still feel it pressing against the glass. The standard explanations point to childhood trauma, the death of his mother, the grinding hardships of frontier poverty, and later, the apocalyptic grief of presiding over a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of his countrymen. All of these factors were certainly real. But there is an emerging understanding in modern neuroscience and epigenetics suggesting that the neurochemical architecture of human emotional life is not built by experience alone. It is also shaped by genetics, by the particular molecular inheritance passed down through generations of ancestors who lived through specific environmental pressures and historical traumas. A lineage that survived by hiding, that persisted through centuries of marginalization and erasure, would not pass down only physical traits to its descendants. It would pass down the biological residue of survival under threat. Lincoln's melancholy may have been, in part, the weight of a story he never knew he was carrying. What makes the discovery of haplogroup X in the Hanks line so resonant is not that it reveals something shameful or sinister about Abraham Lincoln. It reveals something extraordinary. The man who spent his entire life constructing the mythology of the self-made American, the boy born in a log cabin who educated himself by firelight and rose through sheer force of will to the highest office in the land, was in reality something far more ancient and far more complex. His bloodline did not begin with a ship crossing the Atlantic in the 1700s. It traced back through a chain of women who each carried this rare genetic inheritance forward in silence, to populations whose presence on this continent predates the entire European chapter of American history. He was not just a product of the frontier. He was, genetically speaking, a product of the deep human past, of migrations and survivals that unfolded over millennia before a single log cabin was ever raised in Kentucky. The irony is almost unbearable. The man who kept his maternal heritage locked away in shame, who refused to honor his mother's grave for years, who reinvented himself as a man without a past because the past felt too dangerous to claim, that man was carrying in his cells one of the most remarkable origin stories that American soil has ever produced. The broader significance of what the genetics of Nancy Hanks reveals extends beyond one family, one president, and one remarkable life. It forces a fundamental re-examination of what the American frontier actually was. The dominant mythology presents it as a clean, progressive story. European settlers moving westward, carrying civilization into wilderness, building a new nation from raw materials and raw determination. But the genetic record tells a far more complicated story. It tells a story of populations that were already there, already ancient, already carrying histories that stretched back beyond the reach of any written record. It tells a story of mixing and hiding and surviving and passing, of families like the Hankses who moved through the interstices of recorded history, leaving almost no trace in the documents precisely because their survival depended on leaving no trace. The melting pot of the American frontier was not the simple blending of European nationalities that the textbooks describe. It was a far older, stranger, more layered mixing of human lineages. Some of them so ancient that they carry genetic signatures from a chapter of human migration that mainstream scholarship is still struggling to fully understand. Abraham Lincoln went to his grave believing, or at least fearing, that his origins were a liability. He died without knowing that the blood of Nancy Hanks was not a source of shame but a testament to survival on a scale that most human beings will never comprehend. The woman who bore him, who taught him to read, who gave him whatever inner resources allowed him to endure a depression that would have destroyed most men. She was the last known link in a chain of maternal inheritance stretching back through centuries of shadow and silence to some point of origin that science is still working to map. She was a ghost in the historical record, but she was not nothing. She was the carrier of one of the rarest and most mysterious genetic signatures on the planet, a biological messenger from a world that existed before the world Lincoln was born into. The DNA has spoken the truth that no census form, no marriage record, and no campaign biography ever could. And what it says is this: the most quintessentially American story ever told, the story of a man who rose from nothing, actually began far earlier, traveled far farther, and runs far deeper than anyone, including the man himself, ever dared to imagine.